Okay, so I mean, if anybody wants to come in on that, like, so for instance, this is the Ronan Keane dissent in Abilara, and we'll go through some of the points he makes. But I don't know if any of the 20% of you who voted no in the poll being, do you think the Oireachtas should have the authority to inquire into the circumstances of the shooting of a citizen by a member of the Gardaí in the line of duty? Those of you in the 20% who voted no to that question, no, the Oireachtas should not have that authority. I don't know if there's anything in what Ronan Keane says that you just read there that, gives you pause. I mean, I would be interested to hear your perspective on that. In any case, let's just think back on and reflect on what Keane was getting at. So the first thing he talked about, was the question of an adjudicative power, right? So I think really what the guards were getting at here, or what the applicants were getting at, was this is a case of the Oireachtas invading the judicial power. This is the case of the Oireachtas doing stuff that should be done by a court. Making findings of fact with respect to the conduct of individuals. Exercising adjudicatory powers. Now, Ronan Keane kind of says this, he says, well, think about that for a second. He says, first of all, he says, when you look up the Oxford English Dictionary and you look at adjudicatory power, it explains it in the context of, judicial sentence or sanction. Now he says the Oireachtas Committee is impotent legally. There's no suggestion, he's saying, that anything might come of this inquiry so far as individual culpability is concerned. There's no suggestion at all, he says, that somebody might be sacked or, of course, might be put in jail, on foot of the findings of this inquiry. Second of all, he says, look, we adjudicate on things all the time, and agencies or bodies that aren't courts adjudicate on things all the time. If you read the judgment, which I think you should, not the whole thing, but chunks of it, you'll see he talks about a piano competition at one point. He says, imagine we were to carry out a piano competition, right? The judge in the piano competition is exercising adjudicative authority, I suppose, or is engaging, I suppose, in an adjudicative enterprise. He says nobody is saying that the judge in the piano competition is invading the domain of the courts. Not at all. Right? So similarly here, what Ronan Keane is trying to do is he's trying to drill down and figure out, what is the adjudicative power that is the domain of the courts and the courts alone, and what is something that might be adjudicative in its nature, right? But that would not necessarily mean that it is in the domain of the courts and the courts alone. And I think what he's getting at here is this is something that is quasi-adjudicative, but is not something that is only for the courts and the courts alone, or not the business of Parliament. Now, he later goes on to say, of course, this is the business of Parliament. This has to do with the exercise of its duties by the Gardaí, right? The Minister for Justice is ultimately responsible for policing, is ultimately responsible for the Gardaí. The Minister for Justice cannot be expected to know intimately everything about how the Gardaí carries out its work. It might be in the public interest, it might be in the Minister's interests for, a light to be shone on particular matters so as to better understand things like Garda training in Templemore around emergency response practice, it might be interesting to shine a light on how that worked or didn't work in this particular instance. He says that is the public business. And it is, I think he thinks, entirely appropriate that this is a case of the Oireachtas investigating a matter which matter the minister is responsible to the Oireachtas or the Dáil about. Right, so that's the Ronan Keane. Now, he's not on his own. Justice Murphy, I think, is the other dissenting judge. But they're outvoted 5-2. And Hardiman, let's look at what Hardiman says now.